Gonzaga's Sweet 16 run came to an end against Zach Edey and Purdue, a frustrating finale to a remarkable turnaround and a great sign of things to come for the Zags in 2024-25.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by Game Time. Folks, download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code Locked On for $20 off your first purchase. Well, folks, we're talking Gonzaga season-ending losses, both to Purdue for the men's team, and then a few hours later on Friday evening, the women's team losing to another number one seed in Texas. We're going to talk about those two losses, talk a little bit about the early offseason, what it means for these two programs, where can they end up being next season. And then, of course, as we get into this, we're going to get more into our offseason content, season in review episodes, getting kind of throughout the start of the offseason content. But for now, we're going to recap this game against Purdue. 80-68 was the final score, and I said this on the Locked On College Basketball podcast. It's the 12-point margin feels in some way like a misrepresentation of how close the game was, and in some ways it feels like a misrepresentation of how not close the game was. That was kind of the storyline here. Gonzaga kept it close for the entire first half, was within one at points in the second half. And then as soon as Anton Watson went to the bench with his fourth foul, Purdue just took over from there, and it never felt like it was really within reach for Gonzaga from that point forward. So while a 12-point margin doesn't look terrible, in some ways the game was closer than that. In some ways it was not closer than that. Foul trouble ultimately ended up being what did Gonzaga in this contest. Graham Ike fouled out of the game. Anton Watson fouled out of the game. Ben Gregg picked up two very early fouls and had to sit for most of the first half. Like I said, Purdue went on a big run when Anton Watson had to sit in the second half after picking up his fourth. And yes, there were some questionable foul calls. And I don't want to ultimately spend too long talking about that because it doesn't really matter at this point. Zach Edey doesn't get fouls called on him. That has been a storyline throughout the college basketball season. Every single team who has faced him this year, if you find fans of that team, they will tell you the same thing. It is a consistent storyline. And Zach Edey also probably gets fouled even more often than they call fouls on him. I think both those things can be true, but it was frustrating to see Zach Edey basically take Braden Huff and Ryan Nembhard to the ground on the same play and not get called for a foul. You would hope that it would be that they wouldn't miss blatant ones like that, at least. Does not calling one foul on Zach Edey in the first half make the difference in this game? No, it doesn't. But it was a challenging watch for Gonzaga fans. I know you all felt it. I certainly felt it while watching this game, just not feeling like there was kind of feeling like Gonzaga was powerless in some ways because you knew that any attempt to try to get Zach Edey to commit a foul wasn't going to work. Meanwhile, and again, I don't think that there was a lot of touch fouls called on Gonzaga that weren't fouls, but you have to foul Zach Edey. Like it's hard not to. He's so big, he's so strong, he's so good at getting to his spots. And I think part of the issue here is and part of the reason why I'm blaming the officials, it's never the officials' fault that you lose. But in this situation, it wasn't even just Zach Edey who killed Gonzaga. Braden Smith had an incredible game. And we talked about the growth of the sophomore guards for Purdue from being freshmen last year where they maybe weren't as prepared for the NCAA tournament, certainly losing to Fairleigh Dickinson. And then this year, these two guys looked phenomenal. And Smith more than lawyer in this contest in particular. Lance Jones also had a really big game for them as a transfer. But Braden Smith had 14 points. He had 15 assists and 8 rebounds. He was 6 of 11 from the field. Zach Edey got his 27 and 14. You kind of expect that from him, which is a testament to how remarkable he is. But Braden Smith, the hedging on the ball screens just was not working. Smith was able to find open shooters consistently. His ability to just completely pick apart Gonzaga's defense. I mean, we're used to seeing Ryan Nembhard do that to teams. We're used to seeing Gonzaga point guards in the past do that to teams. And Braden Smith did it as well, as we've seen almost anybody do it, in particular against the Zags. A really, really nice performance from him. And then for Gonzaga, of course, the 3-point shooting, we knew it was going to need to be at or above their typical level, probably above their typical level. And it was not. 6 of 19 from 3 in this game, most of the misses in the second half, kind of similar to what we saw when they played them back in Maui, where now they took 32 threes in that game and only also made 6. So this was a much better shooting performance for Gonzaga, but they made most of their threes in the first half and just went completely cold in the second half. Hickman was 2 of 7. Nembhard was 1 of 4. Greg was 0 of 2, but just a tough game. EK was great, 18 and 10. He had a pair of threes again against Purdue. 4 of his 6 threes on the season came against the Boilermakers. Hickman had 16. Nembhard and Watson each had 14, but there's only 6 other total points scored for Gonzaga in this game. 4 of them came from Braden Huff off the bench. 2 of them came from Ben Gregg. Dusty Stromer played 22 minutes, didn't score. Didn't take any shots, mind you, but didn't score. So that's going to be it on this Purdue game. We don't need to spend a lot more time on it. A very good team beat Gonzaga. There was some officiating. There was some other stuff, but ultimately Gonzaga lost to a really good basketball team. And I think the main storyline, and we'll get more into this, of course, in future episodes, what an incredible season to exceed expectations the way that Gonzaga did. 2 months ago when they weren't expected to be in the NCAA tournament, there was genuine fear that this team was going to end a 24-year streak of making the big dance. The AP top 25 streak, they'd spent 8 years ranked inside the AP top 25 that ended earlier in the year. They didn't even claim, they didn't get an outright claim in the WCC or even a shared claim of the regular season title. That's very rare in Mark Few's tenure to not get at least some claim to the WCC title. Like this team didn't have any quad 1 wins until they beat Kentucky on February 10th. Like things looked rough. And we have that perspective now to see, like, hey, if you told anybody in January or February that this team was going to get a 5 seed, make the Sweet 16, and lose there, I think people would have been pretty happy with that. And it doesn't mean that it feels good to lose. It certainly does not. But I do think that perspective is important of, hey, this was a really good season. And the growth that this team had from the start of the year to the end of the year was genuinely remarkable. We've talked about it a few times on the show already about where this coaching job ranks in Mark Few's tenure in his history. And they talked about it on the broadcast. Didn't love the way Steve Lapis was really intensely pointing out how this was not even close to one of Gonzaga's best rosters. I thought that was a little tone deaf the way that he was saying it, but I understood the sentiment of celebrating Mark Few's job getting this team into the Sweet 16 when they didn't have a Drew Timme, they didn't have a Chet Holmgren or a Jalen Suggs. And that sentiment is valid. Even if the way it was conveyed was maybe not great. But you look at the season, with the hindsight that we have now, a lot of Gonzaga's losses aged pretty well. Some did not. Shout out Washington, not a good team after they beat Gonzaga in Seattle. Santa Clara is a fine team, but they're, have very limited chances of making the tournament. But all the rest of their losses, UConn and Purdue, they're in the Elite Eight. As I'm recording this right now, UConn's in the Final Four. Purdue, that game hasn't happened yet, but they could very well be in the Final Four. San Diego State made the Sweet 16. St. Mary's got a 5 seed, so did every team that Gonzaga lost to besides UW and Santa Clara got a 5 seed or higher in the NCAA tournament. So this team was battle tested and they were prepared for what they ended up facing this season, and it really helped them. And it's helped as the team got their roles defined. When Mark Few went to Graham Ike and said, hey, you can't be deferential. This is not a guard scoring offense where you just happen to clean up. Like, you are the focal point offensively. Once that clicked into place for Graham, everything fell behind it afterwards. Nembhard felt more comfortable in his role as more of a facilitator. Likewise, Hickman felt more comfortable as a scorer. I think that's a really valuable growth point that we saw this year. Hickman didn't feel like he had to facilitate. He didn't feel like he had to just make entry passes and make cuts and not do anything else. He felt empowered to score the basketball. And the growth that he had once that clicked into place, magnificent. So you had that growth from Hickman. You had the growth from Nembhard to figure out his role more clearly. You had Graham Ike's growth. Ben Gregg switching into the starting lineup has been talked about a bunch, and it needs to continue to be talked about because it was a critical move by Mark Few to make that change. Made Ben Gregg better, made Gonzaga's starting lineup better, made Dusty Stromer and the entire bench unit better. It improved every facet of Gonzaga when Mark Few made that move. A masterclass performance from Mark Few to see that, identify that, and choose to make that move. And even Anton Watson, who was able to fill multiple roles, I think once his role became more defined, once it was clear that Ike was the guy who's supposed to do the majority of the scoring, that freed up Watson to be more impactful defensively It freed him up to be more of a cutter. It freed him up to be kind of the, hey, we just need to go get a bucket guy. Let's get the ball into Anton's hands and let him go to work. All of that got kind of cleared up once the Graham EK kind of, once his role got defined, everything fell into place after that. And to watch the way the season grew and developed for this team was one of the true joys of my entire tenure watching Gonzaga basketball. And I know while some people might be hurting now, I hope they can see that in the future, hopefully the soon future, the near future, to be able to look at this team and be like, wow, that was a really incredible journey that we went on from November to March. And you know what, folks, next year could be even more special, because Gonzaga is expected to return everybody except Anton Watson. And with Michael Ajayi coming into the mix from Pepperdine, this team could be very, very good. We're going to talk more about that after a word from today's sponsor, Game Time. Folks, summer is just around the corner, and nothing is worse than wanting a lovely evening at the ballpark and having a frustrating experience getting tickets. Well, good news, Game Time is now an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets even faster and easier. Prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer it gets to first pitch. And with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets. I personally love the Zone Deals feature. It lets you choose an entire section, and then Game Time chooses the seats for you, and it gives you even more savings. The app also has panoramic views from your seat and the best price guarantee, which means if you find tickets cheaper, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast. And we're going to talk about 24-25, what this season might look like for Gonzaga. And look, folks, we got 6 months of content between now and the start of the next season. More than that, it's more like 7 months worth of content. So we're going to have a ton of conversations about the 2024-25 roster, tweaks to it, who's going to start, who's not going to start, who might play, what this role could be, et cetera, et cetera. Stick with us. Hit that subscribe button if you have not done so yet. It is going to be an incredibly fun offseason on Locked On Zags as we get into all of the nitty-gritty details of this upcoming season. But for right now, as we record this on Sunday, March 31st, the Gonzaga Bulldogs are set up to potentially be a top 10 team in the country next year. Because the way that the polls, the AP poll, the way that we do it on Locked On College Basketball typically is you look at a team that has a ton of continuity, that was good the previous year, and that brought in impactful pieces. That's the case for this team. Yes, losing Anton Watson hurts. He's a high-level defensive player, high-level role player, did a little bit of everything, huge contributor, legendary Zag. We will get into more of that, of course, in future episodes as well. But that's the only player for sure leaving. And Theo Lawson spoke to a ton of players, the lead reporter for the Spokesman Review, fantastic journalist. He spoke to a handful of players during their exit interview, and got the sense that it doesn't sound like a lot of people are leaving, if anybody's leaving. And obviously it's the transfer portal era. That can change. But last year there was a sense that things might happen. Dominic Harris leaving last year was not a surprise at all. Hunter Salas was a little bit more of a surprise, but also there was a lot of frustration about his playing time throughout the season last year. Afton Reed, not as big of a surprise, especially when we saw how good Braden Huff was. So that didn't really seem to be the case this year. Playing time was there are a few players who are not in the rotation who probably expected to play more. Jun-Suk Yeo is in that conversation. I'm not even sure if Luka Krajinovic is in that conversation because he joined the team so late and he missed a huge chunk of the year with an injury. So I would be pretty surprised if Luka transferred. Yeo, I guess I could see, but even then, I'm not super confident that will happen. Pavle Stosic, he joined the team in late September, so I don't think there's really any expectation for him. And of the rotation players, I just don't really see anybody leaving. Graham EK, Ryan Nembhard, Ben Gregg, Braden Huff, Nolan Hickman, they pretty much said as much in post-game interviews with Theo. And of course, taking the player's word, what they're saying right after a game, it's not 100% foolproof. Things could change as time passes, but ultimately I'd be very surprised if any of those players left. More people are concerned about Venters or Stromer. I've talked about it in pretty much every episode this week, so I won't spend too much time on it here, but I don't see it for either of them. Venters has always wanted to play at Gonzaga. Why would he transfer after missing an entire year? Who's going to pick him up coming off of an entire season missed with an injury? It just doesn't make sense that he would leave. Stromer, did better down the stretch, had a decent year, but he's in line for a 20-ish minute per game role as a sophomore on a potential top 10 team in the country. Nobody else is offering him that. Why would he transfer after a freshman year to go play at a smaller school, another mid-major school where he'd start, or to go to a Power 6 program where he'd probably play less than 20 minutes per game? It doesn't make sense to me for Dusty Stromer to leave, and I'd be very surprised if that happened. Here's what I think is a potential lineup here. And again, it depends on how Gonzaga views Michael Ajayi and what that role might look like. But when you talk about teams that were, Michigan State, and they're a bad example because they did not do well, but Michigan State was a team that returned basically everybody from a team that went to the Sweet 16 the previous year, and they got a preseason top 5 ranking this past season. North Carolina's got a super high ranking for returning basically everybody. Like, when you do that, you are viewed as this high-level team. And I think Gonzaga is in a position where, looking at what they did, because the reasons they struggled this year were not having that continuity. That won't be a problem next year. The roles are defined. The only player who's going to have a serious role definition is Michael Ajayi, and he's already here. He didn't transfer in August or September. He transferred in March. He's got a whole offseason to spend in Spokane with the Zags, going to summer classes, learning his teammates, getting that camaraderie, practicing, playing, scrimmaging, and getting familiar with what Mark Few wants him to do. Does that mean he's going to perfectly fit his role on day one? Not necessarily, but he's going to be pretty darn close. And everybody else's is set. I guess you could make an argument that Steele Venters is going to need to find his. And that's fair. That's fair. Because not only did he not play last year, he only played in the scrimmage game, but his role is not going to be the same as what it was expected to be last year, because the plan was for him to start at the 3. I expect he's going to come off the bench with Ajayi starting at the 3. So Venters will have to find his role a little bit. Ajayi will have to find his role, but both those guys have a whole offseason to do it. Depending on Steele's health, I don't know when he's going to be out playing full speed. I would suspect that's not there yet. We did see him shooting 3-pointers before the game against Purdue, so he's at least to that point. But either way, having Nembhard and Ike know their roles in the backcourt, having Ben Gregg find his role in a major way, having Graham Ike know what he's supposed to do, having Dusty Stromer probably play a similar role, having Luka Krajinovic be prepared for that third point guard role. I think Gonzaga could potentially add one more player, maybe a veteran point guard to back up Nembhard and Hickman. I could kind of see that, but even then, I kind of already see a rotation and a lineup kind of set for the Zags right now. I talked about this on a recent episode, but I'll say it again here. I expect the starting lineup to be Nembhard, Hickman, Ajayi, Gregg, and Ike. I expect Nembhard and Hickman to each play about 32 minutes a night. That's a little less than they played last year, but I think everybody, even Mark Few, who loves to kind of run his guards as much as he can, would agree that was a little too much. So I think those guys play a little bit less. I think Ajayi plays 26, 25-ish minutes per game coming in as a starter at the 3. I think Gregg plays 24-ish. Ike plays 25-ish. That's around where they were this past season. Huff comes off the bench, plays about 18 minutes a game. That's a little more, but he's got to fill some of those minutes from Anton Watson's departure. And then I have Steele and Dusty each played about 19 minutes a game. They'll play at the 3. They'll play a little bit at the 2 whenever Nembhard or Hickman is sitting. One of those, whoever's sitting will be sitting. Whoever's not sitting will be playing point guard. And then Steele or Dusty will kind of be playing the 2. I think that's where they get a lot of their minutes. They also fill in for Ajayi. I think we could potentially see some 4-guard lineups with Ajayi playing the 4 and either Ike or Huff playing the 5. You could even run some really spaced out lineups. I talked about this on Twitter. Not as a starting lineup. A lot of people panicked and I thought Graham Ike was leaving, but I could see situational lineups where Gonzaga plays Ben Gregg at the 5, Ajayi at the 4, Steele at the 3, Hickman and Nembhard at the 1 and the 2. And that's not a great defensive lineup, but it's going to be a major problem if they're playing teams that have like a big center who just only excels in drop coverage and doesn't play well away from the rim. Now they're going to have struggled to defend said player, but I like that kind of lineup flexibility that Mark Few's team is going to have next year. I have Krajinovic as well as Yo, as well as Pavlik out of the rotation. Again, if people want to pick somebody to panic about potentially transferring, I could see it being Yo, but again, I don't know how many teams were really in on him before Gonzaga signed him, but I don't think there's a lot of teams chomping at the bit to add Junsook Yo after he didn't really carve out any kind of role for Gonzaga. I think for him, it's less about him entering the transfer portal and more about him potentially just going back home and playing professionally in Korea, which I frankly could see. I would like to see him stick around and continue to develop, but I wouldn't be surprised if he makes that decision. And look, the Zags are going to miss Anton. I'm sitting here telling you how great this team's going to be next year and how they could be a preseason top 10 team and how everybody's got their role. And all that is true, but it doesn't mean that they just magically are going to be able to replace what Anton Watson brings from an intangible perspective, from a leadership perspective, from a defensive instincts perspective. He's a really hard player to replace. Ben Gregg does a lot of those things, which is very helpful. I think Michael Ajayi can bring some elements to this team from an athletic perspective that are somewhat similar to Watson, but he's not a player that you just fully replace. He's a quintessential Zags, Spokane kid, blue collar attitude. Like he is Gonzaga basketball in so many ways. And we're going to have a full episode or episodes maybe dedicated to Anton Watson this offseason, so I won't go into all of it here. But he's one of my favorite players in Gonzaga basketball history. For those of you who listened back in the Zags score days before I even started at Locked On Zags, one of my first episodes ever as a Gonzaga podcaster was about freshman year Anton Watson, right before he got hurt with that shoulder injury. So I always kind of associate him with the start of my Gonzaga podcasting career. So it's a bit bittersweet to see him move on, but very excited to see what happens for him next. Well, the Lady Zags season ended 2 hours after the men when they fell to number 1 seed Texas in Portland. It ended a tremendous era for Lisa Fortier's team. More coming up on that team and their future. After a word from today's sponsor, Amazon Fire TV. Folks, Fire TV is your destination for sports, from live games to highlights to in-depth analysis. And Fire TV offers amazing viewing experiences with smart TVs, as well as the Fire TV stick that you can plug into your existing TV to provide access to millions of movies and TV shows, as well as free and live TV. Whether it's March Madness or opening weekend for baseball, which we're just getting through, you're going to want to have yourself a Fire TV. We have Fire TV sticks on every TV in our house because I love the layout. I love the user experience. The remote is super handy. It has little buttons that take you directly to Prime Video, Netflix, Disney Plus, and Hulu. And Fire TV also recently created Fire TV channels to deliver a constant supply of the latest videos from your favorite sporting brands, including Locked On. So you can come see our pretty faces talking to you on the Locked On Podcast Network at Amazon Fire TV. Check out Fire TV channels on Fire TV and Alexa devices. If you haven't done so, you should. Trust me on this. To learn more, visit amazon.com/LockedOnFireTV. All right, folks, segment 3, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags, and not the most fun that 2 of the 3 segments for today's show are talking about Gonzaga's season's ending, but unfortunately, Lisa Fortier and the women's basketball team could not find enough offense to take down the number 1 seeded Texas Longhorns in Portland on Friday. Again, this game tipped 2 hours after Gonzaga's men's team lost to Purdue. Frustrating day for this team. They only scored 9 points in each of the first 2 quarters. A team that was a prolific offensive team throughout the regular season just went cold. Shout out to Texas. They're a very good team, long, athletic, played very good defensively, and just managed to have the right game plan to prevent this Gonzaga team from doing what they've been doing all year long. Yvonne Ejim had a great game, 14 points, 6 of 6 from the free throw line. She was only 4 of 10 from the field. So maybe not a great game, but she was the best player for the Zags in this one. Brynna Maxwell, 13.6 steals for her in her final collegiate game. And the sad story was the Truong twins. 2 icons in Gonzaga women's basketball history, 2 of the greatest to do it, 2 of the best passing guards in Gonzaga women's basketball history. I think they're 2nd and 4th all-time in assists for this program, and yet they did not have a good game, either of them. Kayleigh and Kaylynne both struggled. They were combined 3 of 18 from the field, and this one 1 of 12 from 3. They had a combined 5 assists and 6 turnovers, and it's just hard to see their careers end this way. Watson had a decent game for the men's team in his final game, but it is really hard to see players not perform at the level we're used to seeing them play at in their final game. And it's just sad. It's not anger inducing. I mean, it's frustrating, certainly for them more than anybody else, but it's just sad because you know they're capable of more, and they just didn't have it in that game for whatever reason. But what an incredible season for this women's team. And we talked about it so many times on this podcast, and I feel like we could have talked about it more, but this team was otherworldly. This year, they finished the year 32-4. They were undefeated in the WCC. They, of course, lost in the WCC championship game in Portland, or against Portland in Vegas, but it didn't even prevent them from getting a 4 seed, from hosting a region in Spokane. That is incredible that they were able to do that. They had this massive non-conference win over Stanford. They blew out everybody they played in the regular season. One of the most dominant West Coast Conference seasons in history, men's or women's side, just absolute dominance. From top to bottom, 65-point win over Pacific, multiple 35-point wins, won almost all of their games by 20-plus points. just an incredible season of dominance. Yvonne Ejim put together an All-American caliber campaign. This team shot it from blistering hot from three. Maxwell was an incredible addition for the last 2 years. The Truong twins obviously have been fantastic Zags for the last 4 or 5 years. Eliza Hollingsworth was fantastic this year as well. It was an extraordinarily fun season to watch. They beat Utah in the kennel to advance. Like, just the place was rocking. The atmosphere, the environment was incredible. They ran out into the crowd to celebrate with the Gonzaga fans. Like, just an awesome, wholesome moment for Gonzaga basketball. And it's unfortunate that the season ended the way that it did, but really great storyline. Now they're kind of in the opposite situation of the men's team, where the men's team is retaining everybody except their starting power forward and their kind of key player. The women's team is losing the majority of their talented players, with the exception of Yvonne Ejim, who is sticking around for a 5th year. She's going to probably build on an All-American campaign, potentially do it again next year at this level. But the rest of the starting lineup is more or less gone. The Truong twins, they're out of eligibility. Brynna Maxwell, she's out of eligibility. They're all gone. Reserve big Destiny Burton, out of eligibility. Eliza Hollingsworth's a question. I believe she has another year of eligibility. She's been at Gonzaga for 4 years. I think she has a 5th year because of the COVID eligibility. It would be really great to have her back. You'd have your 2 starting front court players, Yvonne at the 5, Eliza at the 4. She averaged 10.7 boards, 2.2 assists this year. But it's going to be a situation where some of the reserves who didn't play all that much this year because of how good that starting 5 was, they're going to have to step up. Maud Hybens, huge part of that. She was one of the best players off the bench the entire WCC this past year. Very likely to kind of follow in the footsteps of players like Melody Kempton and Yvonne Ejim, who have stepped into bigger roles after being 6th Woman of the Year. I think Hybens has the capability to do that without a doubt. Callie Stokes, Esther Little are 2 players who are going to need to step up, who showed flashes of excellence at times this year, but just weren't counted on all that much because they didn't need them as much because of the Truong twins. Naya Ojukwu, transfer from Utah. She played very seldomly this year, but could be in line for a bigger role next year. Bree Stallen-Bien, unfortunately suffered another knee injury and is contemplating whether she's going to continue to play in her career. If she chooses not to, that is very understandable. It's unfortunate how many injuries she has already suffered, but if she does decide to play and she gets healthy, she could be a valuable piece as well. Freshman Claire O'Connor only played sparingly this year, 1.2 points per game, but she'll have a bigger role. They also have 3 incoming freshmen, including center Lauren Whitaker from New Zealand, who's a really highly regarded prospect. So this team's going to have more question marks next year, certainly than the men's team, and certainly than they've had in the past couple of years, just because of how long the Truong twins and Eliza and everybody and Yvonne, of course, have been in this program. But they're going to add talent. They already have 3 talented freshmen coming in. We mentioned Whitaker, Allie Turner, and Cristobal Osorobo, from Spain. All 3 coming in. Claire O'Connor, again, steps into a bigger role most likely, as well as Callie, Esther, and Maud. We'll see if Coach Fortier navigates the transfer portal. They haven't done it much since the portal's been a big thing, partly because they haven't had a lot of openings. So it's not like we know that she's not going to use it. It just hasn't been necessary. I suspect certainly if they lose any more players or if they feel like there are some holes on this roster, that she'll do what she can to navigate it, especially coming off of this successful year. I think there's a good chance they'll be able to land some key pieces if they feel that that's necessary. So we'll be tracking this offseason for Coach Fortier's team coming off this incredible season. It's going to feel hard to replicate this kind of success with the amount of talent leaving the program, but Coach Fortier's reloaded before and it has worked tremendously. So I have a lot of confidence that can continue to be the case for this women's program in Spokane. It's going to wrap it up for us today here on the Locked On Zags podcast. We will be back. We got some mailbag questions that we're going to get to later this week. We'll start our season in review series about the players on the team as well. All that coming up later this week. Thanks again for making the show your first listen or your first watch of the day. Stick with us in the off season here on Locked On Zags. We got some fun content coming your way. Hit that subscribe button if you have not done so yet. Thanks again for listening. And even though the season is over, we'll give a hearty, as always, go Zags.